Unit 3 in our program. I'm going to present a batch of material for probably about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for questions. But I really have to start with the material that frames this unit, right? And this piece is about why we are so divided about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and why our political positions are different. Sometimes when we imagine that our divisions are a result of the fact that, maybe we know the facts and somebody else doesn't, right? Then we get frustrated because, people are stubborn about not accepting our facts, right? But maybe the causes of some of our disagreements are not based on facts. They exist because we have different narratives about Israel. People approach Israel with different lenses. And that influences how we understand certain facts, right? And which facts are more relevant, right? So we're going to talk about these different narratives that people have about Israel, and hopefully that can help us understand what motivates different positions, right? And just kind of as an introduction to this, remember that how we relate to Israel is going to be informed partly just by what generation we're part of. So, for instance, if you are a Jew who was born in the 1930s, okay, and you lived through the horrors of the Holocaust and the miracle of the rebirth of the state of Israel, that's going to inform how you think about the Israel narrative, right? Yeah, because this story of destruction to resurgence, it's not just a story to that person. You lived through it if you are part of that generation. Well, if you're somebody who was born in the 1990s, your view of that is going to be totally different. Right? You may be aware of the historical facts, from the Holocaust to the beginnings of Israel and way beyond, but you don't experience them the same way.
And therefore?
And not questions now, okay? It's just there'll be time for questions
But
later.
you said it about 30 people.
I'm sorry, not now, okay? So we're going to try and take stock of certain narratives, you might call them meta narratives, about what the state of Israel means. And they are all myths, but when I call them myths, right, doesn't mean that they're not true, right? And sometimes they're even based on facts, okay? So, for all of us, especially those of us who don't live in Israel, Israel is to some extent an imaginative exercise, right? We carry around a certain amount of imagination about what Israel is supposed to be, and some of that depends on our understanding of Jewish history and where we fit into it. It may be based on reality, but it's still the Israel you imagine, okay? So each of us kind of has a template about Israel, and we evaluate it based on that template. Let's take a look at 4 different narratives about the conflict. Sorry for those of you viewing from home, I wrote this on the wall, but I can't show it to you, but hopefully you'll follow it, all right? So 4 different narratives that many of us are carrying around, and they all animate and inform how we think about the state of Israel and what is happening in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Narrative number 1 is about the Israel of Messianic utopian universalism. So this view of Zionism says Israel is to be a visionary model state that benefits all the nations of the world. We use the word messianic because that suggests that, we're supposed to be as close as possible to the ideal state. Okay, that's the way Israel should work. It should be as perfect as possible. Whether your ideal is religious or secular really doesn't matter. Okay? Utopian, right? That suggests that it is like no other place. Okay? It is a model civilization, however you would define that. And universalism, right? This is a key word, suggests that Israel's success is evaluated not just by being perfect for Jews, but being perfect for everyone in the world. Now, people who have this vision of Zionism will celebrate all of Israel's great accomplishments for the world, the contributions we make to other communities, like going to Haiti and dealing with disasters there and lots of other places, right? And people who have this vision will say Israel should be held to a higher standard than other states, right? And they connect their Zionism to Israel's success, not just because it's a place of safety and security for the Jewish people, but as a contribution to humankind, right? Far beyond Israel's borders, right? And this ideology is rooted in the vision of the prophets, which those of you who are in the class on the prophets will definitely appreciate, right? Right? Because some of those texts imagine the Messianic era as a time where the natural order is going to change, and the whole world will come to know God's majesty as it radiates out from Jerusalem, right? Jerusalem, the mythical city on the hill, okay? By the way, Theodore Herzl subscribed to this vision of Israel, right? The Jewish state, right? And his book, The Jewish State, lays out all those arguments very clearly, that Zionism's vision of statehood was something that required a commitment to something beyond Israel itself. The philosopher Martin Buber also subscribed to something a very similar portrait of Zionism. It was a movement that would start to bring back the legitimacy of the Jewish people, but also that it would promote a greater universalist message, a legacy for all the nations of the world. Okay, so the strength of narrative number 1, right? It's, we aim high, right? It's, who doesn't have at least one dream at some time in your life of, the time when there's no gap between what we ought to be and what we actually are, right? You want to bridge the gap from the real to the ideal. So it's aiming high. It's a majestic possibility, right? What's the limitation of this narrative? Well, in utopianism, what often happens is that the perfect becomes the enemy of the good, right? If the state that you long for is tied to a vision of perfection, what happens when the state's not perfect, right? Do you walk away from it? Do you get soured on it? do you set yourself up for disappointment when, the Israel you think should be doesn't live up to that vision, right? So, maybe, part of the Jewish people sets Israel up to an unreasonable standard of expectations. That's vision number one, and its strength and its weaknesses, okay? Narrative number two. This is Messianic Particularism, all right? This is about the fulfillment of the particular story of the Jewish people, right? And they're like number one, there's a redemptive quality to it as well. But this one focuses entirely on how good Israel is for the Jewish people, right? And religious Zionism buys into this, and it frames the birth of the state of Israel in these kinds of religious terms. Like, when we say the prayer for the state of Israel, the Hebrew words are Reshit Tzmichat Ge'ulatenu, the beginning of the flowering of the redemption. So that's a pretty ambitious portrait, right? Yeah, that's a big goal, even if it's just the goal for the Jewish people, right? And it also has a certain prophetic quality to it, right? There's a wonderful phrase in the book of Numbers, the story of Bilam, the non-Jewish prophet who was hired to curse the Jews and actually winds up blessing the Jews because that's all God is going to let him do, right? Right? So he describes them as Am Levadad Yishkon, a people that dwells apart. Right? In other words, the Jews are different from other people, and they're supposed to be, and they're supposed to live up to a higher standard, right? But, we imagine ourselves, rightly or otherwise, as fundamentally different from other nations of the world. This is Messianic particularism, right? We're not judging or evaluating our strength as a people based on a city on the hill to which all other nations are drawn. All we want to be is God's people and be left alone to play out our story, right? So, this is found in a lot of religious Zionist liturgy and literature talking about how historical events have changed the conditions for the Jewish people. The Jewish people have returned to history, to the family of nations, and this is the ultimate fulfillment of our role as a Jewish people. So again, the strength of this notion of Messianic particularism is that it has an affirming narrative of history, right? God re-enters history in 1948, and the Yom Kippur War the Six-Day War in 1967, that's, and the ingathering of the exiles from all the nations, right? So it invites Jews to celebrate what is great about the state of Israel for the Jewish people and fulfilling the needs and the wishes and the hopes of the Jewish people. The limitation of this narrative of Messianic particularism is you're trying to find religious affirmations for things that are happening in history. And once you think that God is acting on your side, then it's easy to think that the story is all about you, and you can become very chauvinistic, okay? This narrative is very much in play with Jews who insist that they not be held accountable for the state's moral failures vis-a-vis minority populations, right? You hear this narrative among those who insist that the only criteria for evaluating efforts towards peace or whether they are good for the Jews. Okay? Now, much of our State of Israel's founding literature, including the Declaration of Independence, proposes that Israel should treat all of its inhabitants equally. Right? So this narrative tends to try to replace that emphasis on egalitarianism with a certain self-interested chauvinism, if you focus only on that narrative. That's the problem with narrative number 2. Okay? Narrative number 3, sovereignty and survival. And all this strips Zionism out of any meaning except survival. Why do we have a state of Israel? As the Israeli philosopher Yeshayahu Leibovitz said, it's so that we are not ruled by the Goyim, right? The reason for a state of Israel is just so that we can be in charge of our own life, we survive, right? It's overcoming the vulnerability of having our fate in someone else's hands, right? And this narrative doesn't judge anything that the state of Israel does other than, number 1, defense, right? So security. And number 2, preserving majority rule for the Jews, right? The only objective of Zionism in this is to sustain a place where the Jewish people can go and be strong and take care of themselves. Okay, so the strength of that is obvious, right? Because the need is there for Jews to have a place where they manage their own lives. The limitation of it is that it really doesn't have any other ideology, any other meaning other than our own survival. And so, it can be very difficult for people to have an emotional attachment to it unless they buy into that narrative completely, right? This narrative animates the feelings of many people of the generation of 1967 because they remember, like I remember the 6-Day War, okay? I am old enough to remember. And I know what it was like when Israel was constantly under threat, right? And how good it is when they're not, right? For younger Jews who are looking for meaning in Israel, they don't have the same view of peoplehood. It's a very hard narrative to sustain. If your whole self-definition has nothing to do with, achieving something specific in the world, but only about holding on to power, well, how does that look? How does that feel, particularly to young people? They might say, well, that narrative is kind of like fascism, right? You are ruling over others as a good for its own sake. So the first narrative is the perfect as the enemy of the good. The second narrative is messianism and chauvinism. And the third narrative is being so fixed on your own survival that you forget what survival is for, okay? Those are the traps of these 3 narratives. Number 4 is the narrative of aspiration, where the state of Israel is meant to be a place where the Jewish people's dreams and imaginations can be played out in real time. Rabbi David Hartman, who passed away about a decade ago, was sort of the philosopher of this position in Israel. He says, Israel is an opportunity for the Jewish people to bring about Jewish values in a public square. And we have to sort of balance our ideal imagination with actual power and the challenges of power. Okay? It doesn't read messianic certainty into the historical events of the modern state of Israel. It just says these are all opportunities to fulfill Jewish aspirations we might succeed, we might not. Okay? So the strength of this is that, it tends to promote new viewpoints within Israel. So, in the last couple of decades, you have a lot of optimistic new politicians who have broken into the Israeli scene. People like Yair Lapid and Ruth Calderon, who, they're cultivating Jewish creativity. And they see the peace process as just, it's central to Israel's religious and cultural vibrancy, right? It's more than just maintaining security, maintaining our majority. There are a whole host of opportunities and challenges, right? So that's one of the strengths of this narrative of aspiration. The flaw in it, the problem with it, is that it's ambivalent, and it can be it can make you a little crazy to try to deal with it, right? Because it's not always here or there. If a prophet preaches about the need to seize the moment, well, that prophet can always be disappointed, right? The next great optimistic politician in Israel surfaces in every election. Seems like by the time the next election comes around, they've already fallen on their face because they haven't been able to bring about that kind of aspiration. You can spend a whole lifetime with aspirational language about the meaning of the state of Israel, and you may not get what you want, right? So 4 different narratives, and you can hold on to all of these in some ways, right? They all have strengths and they all have weaknesses. So at this point, let me stop and take questions. Yeah.
You said what the generation of the 1930s therefore thinks. What does this generation of the 90s therefore think?
People who were born in the 90s. So they are not as focused on the lessons of the Holocaust, the need to survive as a state at all costs, right? They're more likely to judge Israel on its own terms, just, how each thing looks. So for instance, the Gaza campaign, all right? So some of us, we know that there is a history, that there's been a constant threat of terrorism from certain elements in the Arab world, not all of them, but many of them, right? And that over time, many of those have passed, right? We have peace with Egypt, we have peace with Jordan, we now have the Abraham Accords, right? And so the people who were born in the 1990s, they relate to that, but they don't necessarily understand how these poor people firing rockets from Gaza are connected to those people who wanted to destroy Israel, right? It's not that they're right, it's the narrative that they are often likely to look through. Okay? Other questions, comments? Okay, so, yeah, Danny.
It strikes me that
And I
you
can't
could
hear
live
that one
without
the mask on.
it.
Why not?
It strikes me that we could do without all of these in a definition of Zionism, except 3. If we're not here to survive and protect the Jewish people, then it's not Zionism.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, there are elements of all of these that one could say are essential, right? Remember I talked last time about
I think we can live
Yitzhak
without
Rabin's comment that, he would be insulted if if the world didn't apply a double standard to Israel, a higher standard, right? In other words, for many Jews, there are elements in all of these that are important to Zionism. Some people might say that if it isn't in some sense messianic, or if it isn't in some sense universal, that it has to be judged by universal ethics, right? Some people will say that it can't really be my state without that.
That's not part of classic definitions of Zionism, I don't think.
It was for Theodor Herzl.
Okay.
I mean, how classical do you want to be? I mean, that's why I mentioned Herzl, because, he absolutely believed that it would be an or lagoyim, a light unto the nations. That was what Israel had to be.
Well, but light to the nation doesn't require a Messiah.
But it is sort of messianic. I mean, he's not talking about a Messiah. He's talking about the state as messianic, as groundbreaking.
Okay.
Yeah. Other questions or comments? Okay, so what I want you to do here is break up into groups of 2. Okay, and I want you to take a few minutes together and again, sort of like what we did in the first session, share where you were born and your first memory or experience of Israel, and talk about which one of these narratives resonates the most for you. Okay, so right now, groups of 2, thank you.
Move the chair. Okay. All right.
Between 2 and 3, but closer to. Yeah. My first memory in Israel.
First,
Okay.
my name is
2 minutes.
Jerry Green.
Make this real quick.
Green, okay. That meet you before?
I wasn't here last year. I was
Okay,
here
well,
the first 2
Okay.
classes.
Okay.
Yeah.
You want to start?
Let's see.
Stand on one foot and tell me everything you know.
2 weeks, yeah. I think he was asking which one of these resonate the most with us. We were there for about 2 weeks. What year was that? That was in 1968. So after and then I met my husband, and we married. And he found out that I went to society. He wanted to was saying about 1967 war is the one that I was in. So we went, that made the most affected me the most. That was the next time. And then, I guess so that might be.
Okay, 30 seconds.
Okay.
Which one?
Okay, so my background, my parents were Holocaust survivors. My mother and my father lost their families in the war. We met displaced persons came from 1967. I was born in a displaced person camp. So being around Holocaust
Wrap it up,
survivors,
everybody.
Israel had a big effect because that was one of the few places where you could go. Fortunately, my mother.
Okay, let's come back together. Thank you all. Thank you all. All. Jerry. Okay, so Who would like to tell us which narrative you fit into?
Oh, I know, we never got around to it.
You didn't get to that,
The answer is yes.
but it's okay, you know, you can just tell us, right? Anyone, where do you fit into, which narrative is your narrative?
Between 2 and 3.
Between 2 and 3, somewhere in there. Yeah, combinations are okay also. Yes, Nick?
Because I
really
didn't like the
think
first
three.
one because of.
Uh-huh,
At my base, that's the base of my opinion, I would have to say that's it.
Daniel, do you agree with that?
I didn't hear what he said. Yeah.
Everybody's talking
The
about.
base, in my opinion, is 3. If I had to pick one, it was like the base of the pillar, that'd be it.
Yeah, okay,
I mean, between.
yeah, for a lot of people, that's pretty basic,
Yeah, right.
right? And again, if your view of the world is that Israel is always up against the world, right?
Yeah.
Now, again, you know, that's also a narrative, right? It's not a fact. Maybe it is a
It is a
fact,
fact.
but it's what we call a myth. Okay, now a myth is not necessarily false, right? Some myths are true. But that's definitely, I mean, each of these is based on your mythical view of Israel and how it fits into the world dynamic. Right? Anybody else want to comment where you fit in? Yeah, Karen.
I would say number 3 also. I was just thinking, if any other country talked about 1 or 2 for themselves, we would think they were right, you know, we'd be afraid of them. We would, you know, it's somehow I know there's a biblical foundation to it, but it seems.
Like we're going to impose our messianic view on you.
Yeah.
Yeah, how's that going to work out? Yeah, I mean, it's like, you know, if you want a polarity response from people, that's one way to get it. Yes, Jerry.
Well, my parents were Holocaust survivors. They lost their original families, and then they ended up in a displaced person camp after the war. And that's where I was born. So even though I'm a naturalized citizen, I was not born in the United States.
Yeah.
In '56, I became a citizen, and they became a citizen.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think, you know, Israel was always a big part of it, because when they were in displaced person camp, they didn't have a bunch of choices. You know, first, you know, you had to, you know, they said, okay, we're going to ship you somewhere. So who do you know in New York that can sponsor you? Yeah, and that kind of thing.
Right.
They had to sort that out. Fortunately, my parents, my father had a brother in Kansas City, and that's how we ended up in Kansas City.
Mhm.
But it could have been just, you know, they went to New York first, they didn't like it. Right? So, I mean,
So what I hear you saying, Jerry, is that of these narratives, you fit into number 3.
Yeah.
Because you know, your choices were limited, your family's choices were limited, but this was the narrative that gave the Jewish people as a people a choice,
Right.
right?
and you know, a lot of my father's other relatives went to Israel first.
Yeah.
And stayed there. So we never went to Israel. But, you know, we never.
But it was
said-
still part of your narrative,
What we said, you know, we would go.
Yeah.
right?
Between 2 and 3.
Right, right. Yes, please.
I just wanted to say that my inclination is number 3. And, you know, I was surprised to hear other people also kind of concur with that, because I feel in some way it's maybe not the proper one for working towards peace, which I want. But I thought that was very interesting, that maybe it's because of the generation or not. I don't know. We have different generations here.
And maybe you just, you know, based on your experience of the world and your knowledge of Israel's history, you see that narrative as the most realistic. Whereas in 1920, Martin Buber, or in 1895, Theodore Herzl might have had that dream of the city on the hill. Right? But after a lot of other things happen, it's just a dream. And the bottom line is stay alive.
Right.
Yeah, Mark.
I think for me, well,
And
I went with
Ronnie.
number 3, but I think the whole Holocaust colors how I view Israel. That's the bottom line.
Well, yeah, I mean, if the Holocaust colors your view, then clearly you're going to look at number 3 as absolutely central,
Yes.
right? And here we are with anti-Semitism on the rise once again. And more Jews will turn to vision number 3, even with problems. Yeah.
That's definitely how I feel, because I'm number 3, even though I'm from a younger generation, but the rise of anti-Semitism in people my age definitely makes me go for number 3.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so I think what we're going to do, because we really need to get this next piece in, we're going to go to one of the interviews dealing with these narratives with Dan Meridor. Right? And here it comes. Yep. So here you see who he is, former Deputy Prime Minister.
Dan, thank you for joining us.
Good morning to you.
Dan, the Jewish people have always been dreamers. Yes, they've had aspirations and longings for Israel. They think they had aspirations about resolving the conflict. And sometimes it feels like the gap between the reality and the aspirations is a cause for, deep distancing from Israel, because it doesn't live up to the dream. And I wanted to ask you, first of all, do you have that problem of this gap between reality and aspirations? What are your aspirations for Israel? And how do you feel about the distance from those aspirations?
The Zionist dream was a revolution in Jewish history. It was not just another turning along the way. It did not only create a nation and a state called Israel, it started with saying that what we believed in, that is to say that we are only a religion, is not the case anymore. We are a nation. This is a statement that is not easily understood. It's not that a nation defined by religion. We are a nation like other nations. You have secular, you have people who believe, who don't believe. We deserve a state. Only nations deserve states, not religions.
Yes.
And then what sort of a state we want to have? We want to be not better, but not worse than others. And states of people, made of people, not all of them of the same nation, not all of them the same religion. And this is how the state of Israel was built. It's a revolution in Jewish history. It's not that we wait for him to do it for us. We do it for him or not for him. Now, when we came to build the state, there was a basic value system on which the state is to be built. And it's taken from a broader value system of how the world is built. That people deserve to be part of a nation, the nation deserves to have states. But in the last analysis, a state is made for its citizens by its citizens. And how do you put together this democratic idea of state of citizens and a Jewish state? If it's Jewish, it's for the Jews. If it's Jewish, it has some religious elements in it. The basic Zionist ideas was not built somewhere in a vacuum. It was built in Europe by the European ideas of nations that get independence and build democracies. And the idea was that the Jewish state means a state where all the citizens are equal and the Jews are a clear majority. Nothing more than that. And
what I'm hearing and what you're saying is an aspiration to be normal rather than to be unique in some way.
Yeah, in this element of having state is normalcy.
Yes.
The values of the society are Jewish values, like the Danes have Danish values and the British have British values, if there are any. I don't want to go into that. But the state is minimal. It's a state. Now, the state was central in fighting for a state because we had no state. But once you have it, the state cannot be the end all.
Yes.
The state is the framework within which we have to develop our values, we have to develop our way of life. Now, what we see changing, and it may be natural, that those who build the state and certain visions that are fully democratic and thought of equality as basis to everything, but a Jewish majority would guarantee the Jewishness of the state, are now not the general concept. There are other dreams that compete. They want to lead. That say, no, it doesn't stem from the human rights to have a state or the community to have a right for a state. No, it stems from the Kodesh Baruch Hu, God, he gave you the land. And it's not about democracy. It's about the rules that were given some other way.
Yeah, so it's less about the fact that the core aspiration wasn't achieved than about the fact that there are so many competing aspirations that are dragging us in different directions, almost to the point of deadlock.
It's natural that people have different aspirations, but there was a common ground.
Yes.
There was a common basis. The basis was, first of all, that we are a democracy. It's not an additional element. We haven't decided as a nation what are the goals. We thought that they were understood. Yes. There were different goals, but there was a basic democratic and Jewish understanding of what is to be the framework, what are the basic common denominators. And this is put now in question. I don't think that between, say, Menachem Begin and Meir Yaari, to take the left wing of Mapam and the other wing called right or not right, Herut, there was a question about should we be democracy? Should all be equal? Should we respect the rule of law? These were the basic elements that keep society together.
Yes.
Now, if one speaks too many times and uses the words rule of law, democracy, human rights, you are depicted leftist.
Yes.
But these were the terms Menachem Begin used to use every day. So there's a change in the basic common ground.
And do you think it's even possible to return to a common goal, to create that infrastructure?
Well, I thought that it's important, and one of the elements that I was trying to promote, and with some success did, but not enough, was the Constitution. I'm quite proud to have been the Minister of Justice in whose time there was basic human rights laws enacted. I thought that we need this basic understanding on which we'll have debates afterwards. But the basic understanding needs to stay there.
But is it even achievable?
I think it is achievable. It depends on people. If the leadership understands the importance, is ready to take some risks in promoting it, and trying to create, again, legally, constitutionally, a constitution that would put the rules of the game, who votes, and how the majority is deciding, and who decides, and what the core values of society. This is something that we are missing. It started with a big mistake of Ben-Gurion, didn't want to have a constitution, and others didn't succeed. We have succeeded in legislating the 11 basic laws of the state. We need to complete it. But this is only the legal constitutional element. There is the values that go beyond and below and above the legal basis.
Is it even achievable to create that kind of common infrastructure of values?
It is absolutely necessary to create it, and it takes leadership to do that. It's quite natural that people have different dreams and people compete, and one should not try to have conformity. No, I would love to see and would enhance debates and controversies, but something should be common. A common goal, common values, basic values, and common understanding of the rules of the game and acceptance of them. Without this, you don't have the framework that is called a society or a state. In the legal aspect, it is a constitution that we are missing. And I try to do that, and with some success, but not fully. I think we need to conclude this work of constitution by legislating the remaining human rights and the rules of the game, what we call the basic law of the legislation. If we do that, people know what the basic values are, that we are democracy, that all men and women are equal. We don't have it in our laws. Only the Supreme Court does it for us. That people have a right to speak, what the Americans call the First Amendment. You don't have it. The basic values should be there, and these should not be changed easily with a simple majority. It should be, say, 2/3 majority or something of that sort. And the rules of the game. You see, people have started to say, it's not for the Knesset to decide. Nobody can give up land that was given to you by God, or nobody has the right because there's something above it. And this needs to be very clear. Yes, the Knesset has a right to decide not everything. You can't take people's rights just for majority will, but there needs to be an understanding of the rules of the game. Here, Constitution plays a very important role.
Is the vision you had of what Israel could be as a younger person, the vision you have of what Israel could be now?
The vision didn't change. Of course, the details change and the magnitude. We are much bigger, much stronger, economically, militarily, even politically, socially. A huge success story. I all my life feel that I am taking part in a project. I don't think a Dane or a Dutch person thinks that way. He's a citizen of the state. I am a citizen, but I am a builder in a project.
Yeah.
When I walk the streets or I drive my car and I see a new bridge being built, I say, we succeeded. When I see some problem somewhere, we have a problem. I feel I'm building a project, not me alone, all this generation and the generation prior to us are taking part in a huge revolution. And the vision always is to have a state that is just, that is built on justice. And we should never leave this road. We should never lose this perspective. We are doing a just cause, not just a cynical, realistic way of life. No, we are doing something that is just. We correct injustice in Jewish history, in world terms, not only in Jewish terms. This is something that should not be lost. And I'm afraid that some people have given up on this.
What in this sense of being part of a project, of part of a cause and not just a country, as is sometimes said, what I think I want to ask you is what makes you proudest in terms of the achievements, in terms of where we are moving in the right direction, and maybe what's disappointing you the most?
Well, I think that what makes me proud is everything that we see here. You know, think of the number of Jews living in independent Jewish state.
Yes.
Over 6 million Jews live here now. Who could have thought of this 67 years ago when we declared our independence? 70 years ago, we just celebrate these days the end of the war, the victory over Germany. What was the Jewish people then? Totally defenseless, no force, no power, nothing. And where are we today? I think the 20th century saw the worst and the best in Jewish history in a very short period of time. We happen to live in that time. So this is really dramatic in every aspect you look at this. And we took part in that by fighting, by building, by doing, by inventing, all of us. So I think it's a huge opportunity that fell upon us, so to speak, in Jewish history, but did not fall upon us. We did it. It's not the hand of divine God. We did not say, we don't say, can I say it in a provocative way? ותחזינה עינינו בשובך לציון, we say ותחזינה עיניך בשובנו לציון.
So that it's our action of returning.
We won't wait for you, Almighty, to do it for us. We don't stay in the galut because we were punished. No, we take our fate in our hands. This is a huge revolution. And you look at it economically, the Israeli economy, was once Minister of Finance, I'm quite in that. I know what all of us have done in these years. Look at Israel as a military force. Look at Israel as an inventing brains. You see that come here, the high-tech companies that you see evolving all the time. You look at Israeli education, the social system. It's a huge success story. And I think this should not tell us everything is okay. No, there are things that don't go well.
What disappoints you?
I think the value system, the idea of equality, it was so inherent to the justice of the cause that we too want to be like others, is lost when people want to put the Jews above the Arabs. Yes. Majority, yes, but all the rest we need to be equal. Don't say day and night, Jewish state, the Arabs, you need to say thank you, you live here. No, it's their state like mine. If not, what is their state? But the intention to change the discourse, to change the terms, to change the atmosphere by insisting of the Jewishness against the democracy is this dichotomy is often now. Of course I'm a Jew. Of course all my life is Jewish and it's what matters to me in life. But it does not mean that once I won the war, I need to humiliate the other. In victory, magnanimity, said Churchill once. We've won this battle historically. Yes. Now don't do to others what you didn't want to be done to you when you were a minority. It's a huge moral test.
It seems to me that a lot of Jews need persuading that we won still at some level.
No, when I say we won, I say it in a simplistic way. Of course, we need to be on guard.
Yes.
And no doubt in this very dramatically changing, falling apart Middle East. You don't know what the morning will bring, and the night will look different than last night. I accept this. It's not that we can sit and idle and do nothing. We need to be on guard. But being on guard doesn't mean that all that you do is just look for the enemies.
Yes.
You look for opportunities in this region. Look what happens in the Middle East, how identities change, how nations fall and religions come up, how tribes come back. See your borders. Take it militarily. Look around. We have a great army, the IDF. We don't have enemies with armies. The Egyptians don't fight us. We have peace with them, thanks to Begin and Sadat. Jordanians are the best friend, thanks to Rabin and Hussein, what happened. Syria has a good army trying very efficiently to kill one another. Yes. So there are no armies to fight the IDF. We have other problems that are from non-state actors. I don't want to go into that. Yes. But things have gone very well. But you see the Middle East, countries that are dead scared from the revolution in the Arab world need allies, and some of it goes under the table, some on the table. You can create opportunities, new ad hoc coalitions, new alliances, but you need to be attentive. Don't enrage everybody.
To what's possible.
Yeah, more is possible on the opportunity side, not just on the threat side.
Dan Meridor, thank you very much.
Thank you.